Welcome to Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach, a podcast that unpacks international trade and how it affects you without putting you to sleep.
Welcome to Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach. We're very lucky to have an amazing guest who just wrote a story that's one of the best I've read in decades, How NAFTA Broke American Politics. It is a must read. Dan is a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine. You've probably seen a lot of his stuff in the New Yorker in the past. Welcome, Dan. Tell us a little bit about your piece in the New York Times Magazine, How NAFTA Broke American Politics.
I wanted to show the long shadow of NAFTA. This is an agreement that was signed into law in 1993 by President Bill Clinton. And it's had a devastating effect, in particular on states that had a lot of manufacturing. And a lot of those jobs were union jobs. These jobs have gone. They were already beginning to go in the 1970s, but NAFTA really accelerated this demise. And it also opened up a whole kind of free trade juggernaut of other agreements, particularly granting China permanent normal trade relations, that have hollowed out these states. And I think a lot of people on the coast don't appreciate the salience of these issues for people, particularly in these states. Just the value of a good job with good benefits, the security. And this was a widely shared sort of modest prosperity. Milwaukee in the 50s and 60s, the second highest median income in the country. And now it has the second lowest of large American cities. And NAFTA was a key part of this. It was a major inflection point. It also was a major turning point in American politics. For the first time, the Democratic Party sort of overcame deep opposition to this agreement from organized labor, which traditionally it was aligned with since the New Deal, and a lot of its congressional members. So I just wanted to understand kind of also, I feel like it's really central to the rise of right-wing populism and Trump's ascent, deindustrialization in general, and NAFTA, which is an agreement that he has criticized heavily in all of his campaigns. That was the impetus for trying to look at this question.
So let's explore a little more what happened practically to people's lives. So I saw the end of that period of really middle-class prosperity that was very much linked to union manufacturing jobs and sense of community from your research and your interviews, what practically happened when these trade agreements literally incentivized offshoring. It just wasn't an accident. There were investor protections that made it cheaper and easier to move the job to Mexico. So then what happened?
People's lives were devastated. I mean, Master Lock, which is the company that I focused on, has been in Milwaukee since the early 1920s. The person who founded it was a very benevolent owner. He treated workers quite fairly. It was a family-like atmosphere. The company was sold in 1970 to a much larger company, and that began to erode. Deindustrialization really began to hit Milwaukee during the Reagan recession. Milwaukee lost about a quarter of its manufacturing jobs between 1979 and 1983. People remember when Paul Volcker raised interest rates to an astronomical level. That had a devastating effect across the Rust Belt states. So there was already a weakening, but Master Lock was going along. It's people, when they spoke to me, one of the things they kept emphasizing was it was like a family. They loved their jobs, and there was a sense of pride about making something. But just bringing the story forward, up until the 90s, it kind of reached its peak. Master Lock had 70% of the market for locks. But at this point, it was already beginning to outsource things to China, including, disastrously, they outsourced gun locks that had to be recalled, 750,000 gun locks, because they could be easily separated. But then Clinton signs NAFTA into law. And a few years after, they began building a factory in Nogales, Mexico. Master Lock had reached a peak employment of about 1,300. Over about a 2-year period, there was almost 1,000 union jobs were gone, largely to Mexico, where people were being paid a tiny fraction of what American workers were paid. A couple hundred workers managed to hang on. This is in the late 90s, early 2000s. But the union had lost almost all its leverage by that point because, as one person described it to me in the piece, there was a foreman walking around saying, like, get back, do your jobs, or else they'll take all the jobs. There was always this implicit threat that the whole plant was going to be shut down. But it started to creep up slightly. They moved a few parts back from China, and they got up to about a little more than 300 workers in the Milwaukee plant. Then it becomes the centerpiece of the 2012 election. And Barack Obama mentions Master Lock in his State of the Union event address as a kind of example of reshoring. And he said it was at full capacity. But what he left out is that there was 1,000 fewer workers there. He didn't mention that most of the jobs had gone to Nogales. And then he follows it up with a visit to Master Lock. That's a tremendous photo op as he was campaigning against Mitt Romney, who he attacked quite heavily as a private equity person who, as his role as CEO of Bain Capital, was closing plants across the Midwest and cutting benefits and so on. So manufacturing has been at the center of American politics, I feel like, for decades. And Master Lock has played a role in that. And then fast forward to last year, and out of nowhere to the workers, a meeting is called one day where it's announced that the plant is closing. And the CEO of the company, Fortune Brands, the multinational that owns Master Lock, is making about $10 million. They have huge revenues. Master Lock has always made a profit. As most of the workers thought, it was the desire to make more profits. And so now they're left scrambling. And some of the people I've talked to are really struggling. And I think what the piece hopefully brings out is a lot of politicians talk about the economy doing good. And then there's good jobs. And there's such a huge gap between those two things. For example, one of the characters, Chancey Adams, did find another job, but it was $10 an hour less. So he had to tap into his severance every month to make his nut. Now he's working two jobs, a morning shift at a non-union metal fabricating place. And then he's delivering pharmaceutical drugs. So he'll get up at 6:30 in the morning, do his shift at this other plant, and then come home, shower, and then work. And he's a remarkable person. Everyone I met was really remarkable. But as you talked about, Lori, there's such a sense of social cohesion that goes along with these kinds of jobs, both from the union, which sort of brings people together across races. It's certainly not perfect, but there's studies that have shown union members are less prone to racial resentment. They tend to be more active in civil society. There's social cohesion. And when people are doing well, and union wages bring up wages for non-union workers as well, there's a ripple effect. When that goes, it's, as many people characterized in the NAFTA debate, the biggest fear for the critics was it was a race to the bottom. There's only downward pressure on wages and the society at large. The union, for example, at Master Lock, they did a biannual, it's in a very impoverished African-American neighborhood in North Milwaukee, a place that used to have more than 20,000 jobs in a small area, the 30th Street Industrial Corridor. A.O. Smith, Briggs and Stratton, these big, iconic. Milwaukee was known as the machine shop of the world, probably second to Detroit as far as per capita industrial power. Master Lock was sort of the last person standing in that. Getting back to what you said about what does it do, it's been so hard for the individual people, but also there's a ripple effect through the community. And most of them said, this neighborhood is only going to get worse. The union used to give Christmas presents to the kids at the school just down the road every year. It's probably 98% African-American school. Almost everybody qualifies for free breakfast, lunch. And they didn't have much, but the union would get a list from each kid, and the members of the union would get them, and they would bring them to the plant. One of the union members would dress up as Santa. And so those kinds of things that are really not quantifiable just by economics or something are gone. Now, to its credit, the union is going to try to continue these efforts that they're doing, which is really touching. But multiply that over all of the plant closings that have happened. And as you know, NAFTA had its own kind of pernicious effects, but then it opened the door politically for other agreements of a similar stripe. Once Clinton was able to overcome that initial opposition, it was difficult until maybe more recently to stop anything. I mean, you know that better than anyone. NAFTA was such a pivotal inflection point, both the American economy and American politics.
And when those manufacturing jobs go, it's the cohesion, but it's also just economically. It's everything we don't think about. It's the restaurants in the area. It's the small businesses that support our daily lives. It's the bait shop because you have to get rid of your boat. And it is the local marina that a bunch of little fishing boats tied up because that's the thing you did in your time off because you got
Right.
time off because you didn't have to have two jobs. And it just has a huge ripple effect through the community. People aren't building, people aren't fixing things in their houses. So the construction industry goes down, the tax base goes down. And when you drive around that part of southeastern Wisconsin, it looks a little bit like a war zone in places.
Totally.
In a way that there's been an economic attack, not a military attack, but the devastation is similar. And then one of the things in your writing that I think is incredibly compelling is you translate what that means, that economic and social disaster, into how it's played out in politics. Now, I think the Democratic Party got a horrific lesson when Trump won in 2016 because largely of the Obama administration pushing for NAFTA on steroids, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, the next big national trade fight that became as popularly discussed as NAFTA. Right through election, they were trying to get ready for a lame duck vote to pass that thing. And having Hillary Clinton associated with NAFTA through her husband, and then having Obama pushing TPP, a whole bunch of people voted in, I think, disgust, fury, looking for someone, even if he was selling snake oil, to basically feel their pain. But I'm very curious because the way you wrote this is you interviewed people on the ground who are living through this. You interviewed dozens of people. So what is your sense of the political translation of how this loss and despair plays into politics?
That's such a great question, Lori. And it's so hard because I've always felt that it's a little bit like free radicals or something. The impact, it's not always rational or linear, it's devastating. One person in the piece was particularly articulate, Jeremiah Hayes. He worked at the wastewater treatment facility. And he said, NAFTA robbed people of their potential. It pushed them aside. And I can't remember the exact words, but it's in the article. People will read it, hopefully. And he said, they're walking around in a whirlwind. There was an uncertainty. And it's true that Trump seized on this. But on the Democratic side, there was also a fight about this. You had Bernie Sanders, a very credible critic from the early days of these trade agreements. He was a very obscure politician when he launched. And then he totally caught fire. And I think that a big part of that was trade and this fatigue and exhaustion with the damage from these neoliberal economic policies. On the Democratic side, now Hillary Clinton was able to narrowly prevail. And so a lot of that energy, as one Republican state senator put it to me in Wisconsin, went over to Trump. People in the media focused on his vicious rhetoric against immigrants and other persecuted groups. And but it was also always twinned with an economic message that was lost on people a lot of times in the media. And I remember in Wisconsin, he was railing relentlessly. He was staging huge rallies in which he would criticize NAFTA. And he was also making rhetorical gestures to protect Social Security, sort of traditional Democratic priorities. But now whether he did those things is a whole other question. I wrote a piece in 2020 that argued that he made many false promises to working class people. But you had an incredible metaphor in Hillary Clinton, who didn't campaign once in Wisconsin during the general election. And this is a state that had been ravaged also by Scott Walker's attacks on the unions. They'd been abandoned also by Barack Obama. They were staging the biggest labor uprising in half century, 100,000 people at the state capitol. And Barack Obama, who had said in 2007 on the campaign trail, if collective bargaining rights are ever attacked, I will put on a pair of comfortable walking shoes and walk on the picket line with you. Of course, he didn't show up in Wisconsin. He didn't campaign for Walker's opponent in a recall election. He basically tried to distance himself from it. In fact, his deputy press person, Stephanie Ruhle, said, this doesn't have anything to do with this, the recall election. So I think that was like, on the one side, you have this sort of appeal of this right-wing populism that's at least acknowledging the devastation from these deals, and then a sort of vacuum on the other side. And as you say, he's pushing TPP in the same sort of retrograde policies, as the political damage is already incredibly clear by then. And it was probably clear in 1994 when the Democrats lost the House for the first time in 40 years. One of my heroes has always been Studs Terkel. I think that the ordinary worker or citizen is often overlooked, and the way that they intersect with these big political changes is often such a powerful and compelling tool. And they're much more open about speaking than a politician typically who's guarded. I feel like their voices are left out. And I just find them, sometimes like Jeremiah Hayes, he put it better than anyone I've ever heard, really. But he also has a more personal connection because he also was a victim of this. So he can maybe see it in a way that some Washington person at a think tank or a politician can't.
So this is part of what is so compelling about Dan's writing. So I want to recommend to everyone, if you didn't catch it the first time around, Google How NAFTA Broke American Politics in the New York Times Magazine. It is an amazing read. And if you want a little bit more of the context of what Dan's been talking about, the way that not having a union, not having a meaningful job can shift politics, but also the hope of what can be the future when we restore some of these institutions and opportunities. Get The Fall of Wisconsin, The Conservative Conquest of a Progressive Bastion, and The Future of American Politics, which is a book about the uprising Dan was describing of union power in Wisconsin. Thank you very much, Dan Kaufman, for the work you've been doing. Folks, please read this piece in the New York Times Magazine, How NAFTA Broke American Politics. Thank you very much, Dan Kaufman. And until next time, it's Lori Wallach with Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach.